Yes, well, thank you for inviting me here today. I'm quite excited to see a whole programme reflecting on the environment movement. So I hope I can add an interesting contribution to what you might have heard already this semester. And I'm very much focusing on the joy and mess of radical environmentalism and non-violent direct action in 1990s Britain. And I'm energised by this particular time in our activist history for two reasons. The first, it was the period where I personally was radicalised into environmentalism in my early 20s, and I was excited by the possibilities offered by grassroots collective change. So it was a time of hopefulness, which I think we might need to draw upon now. And secondly, at the time and in hindsight, this period is really, for me, considered one of the most dynamic for British environmentalism. There were campaign successes. There was extensive creativity and innovation, and many of the tactics and strategies were adopted internationally across Europe and places like Australia. So just a brief caveat, I've never considered myself a historical geographer. I'm a geographer, but my work is deeply empirical, participatory and contemporary in that I work with and write about environmentalism as it happens. And I've rarely looked back to reflect on previous times. So actually, I was quite excited to have this invite and this opportunity to look back on this particular period. But I've not talked about this stuff before, so I'm looking forward to your questions as well. And of course, other people's readings of these times. So I am approaching this question through a combination of autoethnography, very much around my participation and my empirical work at the time. I started working with British environmentalists in 1996. So I guess we were already well into the 90s then. And from that time on, I did interviews and I also collated leaflets and posters, and I took a lot of photography. So all the photographs are taken by me unless credited otherwise. And what I'm particularly interested in today is what this history might help us understand about the present. So in the latter half of the talk, I want to reflect on what has changed since this heady period, its enduring influence, and also what might be next for radical environmentalism. So I'm therefore talking about a very particular subset of environmentalism in the 90s, what was considered radical rather than reformist, and was quite anarchist-inspired, non-violent collective direct action. This, of course, doesn't represent holistically all environmentalism in that period, and other projects, such as the Oral Histories of Environmental Movement in the UK, led by Toby Butler and Roll Holloway, have sought to explore a more rounded and inclusive portrait of that time. In contrast, I've always been drawn towards what I consider more creative and anarchist, disruptive and challenging forms of environmentalism that tend to reject the need for state policy or even engagement in the state, employs what might be considered legal tactics, and also requires quite fundamental shifts in everyday lives and practices. But I'm also not suggesting that this form of environmentalism is novel or unique or even unproblematic. As I'll flag later, I've been involved as an advisory expert in Steve McQueen's latest photography exhibition on resistance in Britain in the last century that's at the Turner Contemporary. It's launching later this month. And radical environmentalism is just one narrative of what, hopefully, if any of you get to go along, is a deeply inventive, risk-taking and effective activist Britain. So just to kind of position it, I'm not saying that this was special or the most interesting form of activism, but I think it tells us something quite interesting. And the history of British environmentalism also includes missteps and absences, especially in its engagement in questions of social justice, racism and colonialism. So I want to start from some personal reflections. You might be able to recognise me here, before I draw out what was distinctive about radical environmentalism at this time. So in 1996, I was in Newcastle upon Tyne. I was just starting a PhD in geography. I'd spent my childhood actually dreaming of sailing on the Greenpeace Rainbow Warrior. And I've got a left-wing feminist mother who instilled a love of all things wild and the need for independence and self-survival skills. But actually, it wasn't until I was 21 that I was pulled into environmental activism. And it was Beth, still a very dear friend, and actually kind of friend slash research participant for the last 30 years, as it happens, who cornered me as I tried to walk to the bus stop one afternoon and convinced me to join a cycling critical mass. And we all met the next day with our bicycles and our banners and our whistles and our music system, and we collectively rode through the city, deliberately blocking traffic in a call for better road safety for cyclists, to reclaim the streets from cars and pollution, and to have fun. And I loved it. I loved everything about it. The freedom of cycling in the middle of the road, the immense sense of belonging with others, the fun and laughter, and also, it turns out, I quite enjoyed breaking the law. Didn't want to get arrested, but I quite enjoyed the risk that that gave us. So from that day on, I threw myself into every aspect of what was called Tyneside Action for People and Planet. I changed my PhD, which was at that time on geospatial statistics, and luckily I switched it to work with environmentalists employing internet technologies to organise. And I revelled in how my academic and personal life entwined through participatory activist research. Tyneside Action for People and Planet, or TAP for short, was very much part of the emergence of Earth First in Britain. And most of what we did connected into the Earth First network. I attended their trainings and gatherings, and I gradually embraced anarchist ideologies, anti-capitalist ethics, do-it-yourself culture, and a belief in non-violent direct action. And I'm going to come back and explain some of these terms if you don't know what I'm talking about. So for the next 5 years, or 4, I was part of Reclaim the Streets events, anti-car street blockades, subvertising, where we would go out and graffiti corporate advertising to challenge capitalism, genetic crop destruction, squatting MP buildings and running free cafes for the homeless, anti-nuclear weapons and arms trades protests, visiting muddy protest camps and anti-consumption campaigns. And looking back, I've realised quite how broad it was in terms of what we were involved in. And although we were based in Newcastle, we joined large protests elsewhere in the country, like anti-capitalist May Day protests in central London, Reclaim the Streets and Hull. And all of this gave my life a really deep sense of purpose and connection. And you might recognise another geographer here, Professor Paul Chatterton, now at Leeds. We met through activism at this time, and it very much inspired some of our early work together on autonomous geographies, because we had literally done this activism together and explored autonomous politics in practice. So I think it's hopefully useful to reflect on what was distinctive about radical environmentalism at this time. And I'm going to spend some time working through these 6 features, which to me combine into a wonderful mix of kind of messiness and joy. It certainly wasn't a manifesto. There was anarchist ideology, but I wouldn't say it was written down in a way that said this is exactly what we stand for. And there are clear historical precedents to many of these, so you can trace the development of certain tactics back through other British and global activist movements. But I think there's something quite unique about how these features came together to form a powerful, liberatory and highly creative resistance moment in environmental history. And as I said, there were also failures in some of the execution of it, or absences or silences, which are much more visible in hindsight, and have also, to some extent, been included in contemporary activisms, but I'm going to come back to the extent that might have happened. So to start with, DIY counterculture and collective identity. So British radical environmentalism at this time emerged as part of the broader new wave of new social movements from the 60s onwards, along with feminist, anti-racist and peace activism. And what was distinctive about these social movements was they no longer centred around conflicts of class, and therefore they weren't focused on struggles between workers and employers, or resource distribution, or in necessarily seeking inclusion in existing political structures. Instead, they sought to challenge the very logic of the dominant systems of society. And Alberto Melucci articulated this as a process of challenging the cultural codes of society, which required producing new meanings and new forms of social life. And these countercultures are generated through the building of collective identities and their cultural production. So with each of these pictures that I'm sharing, I'm trying to get a capture and an essence of what pulled us together. So these sorts of actions, while we were actually protesting against genetically modified crops, it was in the camaraderie and the togetherness of us spending time together in activism that really helped build that counterculture. And British radical environmentalism was as concerned with the personal and cultural activism as it was with political engagement. And you can see that here. It's a no shop day in November 98. We ran a shopaholics clinic where we would help people overcome the desire to shop and consume. And this was in central Newcastle. And it was all very good-natured, but we weren't asking people to lobby anything or sign anything or change any kind of broader political situation. We were asking people to take personal and cultural action to change. So the audience wasn't the political establishment, it was society at large. And here I think the term DIY culture really represents what this counterculture was doing. And George Mackay described this as a youth-centred and directed cluster of interests and practices around green radicalism, direct action politics, new musical sounds and experience as a kind of 90s counterculture. And you can see this in all sorts of different spaces. So the Green Festival was an advert to take action, but it was also a celebration of all things alternative. So it's a narrative of challenging dominant systems and doing things in different ways. And it was particularly attractive to younger generations. We were all in our early 20s, really, except for one couple. And it was about rejecting the formal and reformist non-governmental environmental organisations. So while I'd spent my childhood dreaming of going on the Greenpeace Rainbow Warrior, after I joined this joined being a rather formal word for an informal action, I ended up being a critic of Greenpeace as a formal organisation. And the purpose here was to embrace new forms of meaning making that challenged our everyday lived realities. And this approach relied on subterranean networks of environmental activists, which motivate us and gave meaning to individuals' political activism and needs. And that's why I really noticed looking back in the sheer complexity of all the different topics that this one group was involved in, but it all made sense. It all had a broader understanding if it was about challenging capitalism. And these networks and the social cultural bonds of collective identities were vital in sustaining activist commitment to enduring, for example, months of living in makeshift muddy protest camps. This one's at Limage Forest in Kent. And it didn't really matter what time of year I went, it always seemed to look quite muddy and cold. And they were dedicating their daily lives to a lived environmental resistance. But there were also, crucially, new expressions of pleasure, valuing the emotions of joy and playfulness and happiness and hopefulness were vital in energising and sustaining protest. And I remember often I would go to actions, not particularly because I was that passionate about the particular politics, but because I knew it'd be fun and I knew my friends would be there. So, for example, while objecting to road building and the dominance of car culture, Reclaim the Streets was also about having fun, celebrating enjoyable alternatives to rampant consumption. And you can see on the poster, it says, you know, they want to fight, we want to dance. So there was very much a focus on party as protest. It was around protest as drama, celebration, revelry, creating a spectacle alternative ways of being, but crucially having fun in that. And I can still hear the samba drums of street protest ringing in my ears. The second defining feature for me is the way in which the enemy was named, not as the state, but initially as globalization. So differentiated from previous movements focused on class struggle, radical environmentalism explicitly identified the cause of environmental destruction as the results of transnational corporations and the globalization of trade, particularly at that time through organisations like the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund. And while initially the kind of language was around anti-globalization, especially coming from the protests in Seattle, the dominant code being challenged was the predominance of capitalism and its rampant globally extractive practices. And this kind of emerged quite quickly, you can see here in the subtle sign, where resistance included explicitly anti-capitalist protests. For example, June the 18th in 1998 and May Day in 2000 in central London deliberately targeted the City of London and businesses seeking to prevent trading, deliberately causing property damage and financial pain, and trying to expose capitalism's environmental consequences. So it was targeted not just in terms of who they might be opposed to, but in terms of disrupting certain types of trade. And Anne-Marie Starr captured this moment as a contestation over what global society was possible, with one of the slogans at the time being, "Another world is possible." So it's a combination of resisting this corporate dominance through direct action and the creation of anarchist globalization networks from below. So here there's at the May Day, which was in central London, and it was very much about targeting the City of London and also disrupting any political decision-making. The lawn in front of Big Ben was also dug up through an act of guerrilla gardening, and seeds and trees and things were planted there as a deliberate kind of alternative. And of course, we can critique the fact that that did not last long, but it was building on the guerrilla gardening movement that actually continues now, where people plant and grow in spaces that they might not own, or they might be particularly areas of the city that are disregarded. So these networks were documented by collectives like People's Global Action and Notes from Nowhere, and their book We Are Everywhere, which celebrated global examples of autonomy, carnival, clandestinity, and taking power. And what was distinctive here was the construction of international networks of solidarity between diverse places and causes through a commonality in what was being opposed, and in the quest to shape the world in populist, participatory and just ways, be that through new forms of grassroots globalisation or de-linking into more local or bioregional configurations. So it wasn't so much that everyone agreed on what the alternatives were, it was very much that the central naming of the enemy was capitalism. In Britain, the alternatives to this capitalist globalisation were a bit vague, to be honest, and quite small scale at this time. It was like community gardens or free food dumpster diving, and alternative media like indie media represented here. In comparison, in the early 2000s, for example, in Argentina, where there was mass occupation of factories and neighbourhood self-governing assemblies, which was much more organised and much more able to say this is what the alternative looks like and actually put it into practice. Indeed, at the time, while British radical environmentalism articulated resistance to global capitalism, there was still quite strong remnants of an emphasis on individual behaviour change, not just in that no shop day that I showed you, but this is the newsletter for the group I was part of, and it was very much think globally, act locally, rather than a kind of sustained system change. The third distinctive feature is horizontalism. So Marina Citrin detailed these global grassroots networks were built through a deep commitment to horizontal organisational forms, and they were infused by the anarchist ethic of rejection of any hierarchies, especially around leadership and power. So networks like Earth First and Reclaim the Streets and Critical Mass were purposefully very loosely organised and non-hierarchical. There were no membership lists, no leaders, no clear strategy. Rather, these networks were composed of self-identifying affinity groups. And while these place-based affinity groups like TAP or GENO, which I was part of, shared a common purpose or values, they tended to make their decisions through consensus, but they wouldn't then check their strategy with anyone else. So they'd be loosely affiliated with a number of networks like Earth First. And they would take inspiration and training and support from other affinity networks, but they would collectively decide what actions they would participate in. So this is some Earth First inspired training up in the Northeast, where we were learning how to tie knots in order to then install a tripod to block a road. The seeming complexity of these subterranean networks were obviously designed to thwart police surveillance and intervention. It enabled a form of organised chaos where targets struggled to estimate protest size or composition in advance. And that, to me, is one of the most exciting things, that it was very difficult, certainly in this period, for the police to have any insider knowledge. And although certain activists might have emerged as particularly well connected and influential within British radical environmentalism, they had no clear lines of power, resources, or responsibility, which made it harder for the police to identify and charge them. And if they were arrested, the network simply continued, as the decision-making and skills were already dispersed. In contrast, for example, Friends of the Earth got involved with the Newbury anti-roads protest, and because they were hierarchical and identifiable, they quite quickly got their assets seized by the police. And those who weren't part of formal organisations were able to avoid some of that a bit more clearly. So horizontalism enabled a freedom and autonomy in participation, tactical choices and decision-making. So these affinity groups could seek to influence national strategy of some of these networks through direct democracy processes or assemblies held at meeting points like the Earth First summer gatherings, which is when we would all go together and have some of those broader conversations. But each affinity group chose their own tactics. So the extent to which they engaged in different levels of acts or illegal acts like sabotage or occupations was only determined by participants of that group through their own self-management. And certainly in TAP, I'm not sure how true it was of other affinity groups, any member of our group could opt out of any action if they felt uncomfortable with the choice of risk or chose a different role in that action. So, for example, I preferred the support roles of planning and banner making and photography. Not a very fast runner, to be honest, and I didn't really think I could climb on top of a truck and lock myself on. So I didn't do that, but I supported the action and I took other risks, if you see what I mean, to be there with them. So the horizontalism was a defining feature of radical environmentalism and a clear rejection of the reformist and hierarchical structured environmental organisations. In the long run, it actually created space for Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace to appear politically moderate and therefore gain access to formal political spaces. And I do think that some of the successes that groups like Friends of the Earth had in the Climate Change Act, for example, was partly because they looked much easier to deal with than these more anarchist-inspired affinity groups. The fourth feature, which I'm calling do or die, was this deep commitment to direct action. And while there were intellectual discussions around anarchist ideologies and strategies, these were always overshadowed by a real focus on doing and taking non-violent direct action in particular places. So Do or Die was an Earth First slogan, and it was the name of their newsletter, and it was often followed with, if not you, who? So everyone had to take responsibility for doing something, whatever that was. It demanded participation. And if you stayed on the sidelines, you were viewed with some suspicion. So early in my involvement, especially because I had a camera, you know, I got accused of being basically an undercover cop. And you kind of had to prove yourself because you were meant to be taking action with everyone else. And likewise, the term DIY was a deliberate call to do it yourself. And it's advanced a bit more now to do it together, which I really like. But at the time it was quite individualistic and it was quite macho. You don't wait for anyone else, you do it yourself. And the repertoires of action employed by networks like Earth First to reclaim the streets were creative and often involved the building of material structures to block development or the destruction and sabotage of materials. So lots of anti-road protests on the M3 down at Twyford Down or Newbury Bypass or the M11 established quite long-running protest camps in the path of developments. And this is Limage Forest, which was actually against a centre parts development, not a road, but happens to be one of the protests that I was aware of and visited often. And here you can see some of the platforms that were built, which were meant to make it harder for them to be evicted. They also built underground tunnels. So you can see here, this is an activist putting wire around one of the platforms to make it harder to access those tunnels. And of course, activists use bicycle locks to lock on to anything that would make it harder to evict them. In anti-genetic modification campaigns, crop trashing was a favoured tactic. And that's when literally activists would go out and pull up some test sites of oilseed rape and destroy them. Advertising billboards were graffitied, a form of subvertising, which I mentioned before. And the idea was change the message to an anti-consumerist one, a tactic that was to kind of just change that cultural code, just challenge that cultural code in ways that people might not have thought about. I think crucial, and I'll come back to this, the aim was to commit these acts while avoiding arrest. Activists were taught how to de-arrest each other and avoid capture. But still, these forms of direction were quite macho, and they required performing endurance and a willingness to suffer. And there was, of course, dissent around what constituted non-violence. I remember spending a whole weekend in Hebden Bridge once debating what is violence, with a common belief, I would say overall, that destruction and sabotage of property was not violent. But of course, the police and the mainstream media disagreed with that interpretation. But overall, I'd say there was quite a minimal engagement with feminism and disability awareness, and not much of a developed set of practices of care beyond holding parties. So it was high intensity, and it was physically very much around looking after yourself, actually. Subvertising, which I mentioned, you can see here, Nescafe was targeted quite deliberately, along with the publication of alternative media and zines and banners were a form of culture jamming. So part of the broader quest kind of challenged those dominant codes. And this DIY counterculture sought to be generative and reactive alongside this protest and resistance. So these street parties were about having fun, but also a form of prefiguration. So, for example, this was a protest against the construction of a new car park, and we took along plants and trees and made the point that it should be trees, not cars. So these guerrilla gardening were purposely positive and tried to demonstrate the doing of alternative, even though they were often quite temporary. The fifth distinctive feature is that most of these tactics required environmentalists to put their bodies on the line. And you can see here the activist at the top has locked herself onto this nuclear weapon convoy that was going to Fad Lane with a bike lock, which made it particularly difficult because you have to cut those off. So they had to have specialist equipment, which slowed it all down. This obviously isn't a new tactic. There are numerous examples from the suffragettes to other places where body is used as a tool of resistance. But bodies were employed particularly effectively in non-violent direct action. And Brian Doherty termed this a tactic of manufactured vulnerability. So activists would place their bodies in dangerous situations, like locked on to a high branch up a tree or each other, which made it harder to arrest them, frustrating and delaying eviction, and sometimes sustaining protest camps for weeks, if not months. So these disobedient bodies became a defining feature of anti-Rose protests and took on a very public and visible form in the dissemination of emotive images. And quite a few of those images are included in the Resistance exhibition by the national and international media. And also, and it's quite hard if you're not into shimmying up trees, which I'm not very good at, to get good pictures of what some of these tree houses look like. But this is one at Limage Forest. And at other places like the M11 in London, where environmentalists built towers and rigged up nets between buildings to make it difficult for the police to evict them. And each protest seemed to employ increasingly physically dangerous methods. Networks of tree houses were built at Newbury, and some of these tunnels under the A30 in Devon were quite fragile, to be honest. I think one crucial thing, and why I really want to talk about Britain, is that this tactic relied on the decency of police and security staff. Now, I'm not saying that activists thought they were being decent, But in many ways, the British police and the security staff at that time didn't resort to violence or deliberately harming activists, which made it powerful in Britain in ways that it would not work elsewhere. And certainly after this period, I moved to Australia, where the police are less friendly. So I think it's quite contextually important about what works within that security system. And the final defining feature is this notion of swarming. This was a period, and this is what I ended up writing my first book on, where radical environmentalism really creatively adopted information communication technologies, websites, chat forums, emails, and it enabled a speed, anonymity, and reach not previously possible. They were very ahead of the police here, to the point that in the final stages of my PhD, I had a rather worrying phone call from the Met Police asking me for my data, which I didn't give them, but just kind of demonstrated the fact that actually they were playing catch up during this period. This is a cartoon about the June the 18th demonstrations in 1999 against the City of London, and it was simultaneously held in 75 countries at the same time, all opposing capitalism. And the internet technologies were key to mobilising over 10,000 activists for a carnival against capitalism that the police simply weren't prepared for, to the extent that the media called it a riot from cyberspace. And so activists had access to very low-cost, non-hierarchical technologies. They could publish freely, which also meant that they could avoid the formal media. So they were able to literally do reports direct from the street, which now doesn't even seem novel. I get that, but at the time it really was. And groups like Indomedia and Snooze emerged in the UK to directly share the news and do these live streamings. Now, my research showed that actually new people weren't mobilised onto the street in actions like May Day. Rather, it enabled just a good interconnecting of people who were already activist. But it did enable international solidarity, the sharing of tactics, and the use of hacking as a tactic. So hacktivism and electronic civil disobedience was used on these big London events, where a kind of form of denial of service attack, where corporations' email accounts and websites were spammed and bombarded and brought them down. I'm not sure it'd be possible now, it's probably better security, but hacktivism still very much carries on. So given this kind of ability to swarm, at the time it enabled these groups who didn't seem to have any formal organisation to be amazingly effective against groups like Monsanto, as this newspaper article notes. And it was because of their autonomous and horizontal organisational form that they were able to grasp control of communication, transmission and distribution. And they were, albeit temporarily, able to reveal the dominant system of meanings of society wasn't neutral, but reflected vested interests and unequal forms of power. They were seeking, as Alberto Malucci said, to recast the language and cultural codes that organise information. And this did amplify their grassroots power. So, as I said, I'm quite interested in what that means now in compared to what we might think of as another radical environmentalism in more recent years, Extinction Rebellion, that really sort of merged around 2019. And there's been quite some brittling and tension between these two groups. You can see the two slogans here. So you're going from Extinction Rebellion into Earth First slogan. And a lot of people who were involved in Earth First kind of objected to some of the things that Extinction Rebellion did. So I'm quite interested in trying to explore some of the continuances and disjunctures between these two types of radical environmentalism. So I've done a rather blunt comparison, and I want to just pick out what I would say are some of the kind of negative shifts and some of the potentially positive shifts. And again, this is my opinion, and the Earth First column is based on my early research and my participation. And the Extinctions Rebellion is drawing from geographers' PhD research, particularly Stephen Langford, shout out, who did an amazing PhD on Extinction Rebellion, and some others that I've had the joy of being external examiner on. I just want to pull out three, I think, worrying shifts. The first is I wonder if Extinction Rebellion, although it's got a lot of colour and design, is almost slightly less creative in some of its tactics. So there's a lot of repetition of tactics here, of tunnels, of lock-ons, of carnivalesque street demonstrations, of road blockades, of samba bands, puppets and costumes. And although some newer tactics have been used, especially by groups like Just Stop Oil, if you've seen them seek to damage paintings in some art galleries, or I think there was a snooker match disrupted, big orange paint being shown, oh dear, blasted everywhere. In the whole, I would say there's very much a continuance of tactics. I wonder if things have become a bit more serious, and I can see why, but there seem to be fewer free parties and greater police interception. And particularly here in the sort of jail sentences that have been handed out. Larch Maxey, a geographer, is currently spending 3 years in jail for a peaceful protest that activists did regularly in the 90s and weren't even arrested for. So I wonder if now, if there's less hope and joy and more anger, anxiety and urgency, something I've been exploring with my students today, actually. And also I'd like to just pull out that I think we have shifted a bit more to some vertical organisation, a bit more of a distinctive leadership in Extinction Rebellion than there ever was in Earth First. On the positive, I think now it's quite normal for us to understand that we need systemic change rather than individual change. So there's more explicit links to climate justice. There's more links between different articulations of protests. So you might be protesting a coal-powered fire station, but you're deliberately linking it to climate change. And a move away from a focus on individual behaviour change. And I think, interestingly, move therefore less on what individuals can do and perhaps more target of the rich and the wealthy who might have a far greater carbon footprint. I'm tentatively suggesting that there's a bit more consideration of diversity, especially race, but we started from a really, really, really low bar. So that's why it doesn't have a tick, because there's so much work still to be done there. And there is a bit more focus on feminists and care ethics, and that's something in a different research project that I'm really exploring how important they are to sustain ourselves right now, giving a talk in March on how do we carry on in this period of crisis. And again, I mentioned climate justice, and I think there's a bit more of a connection between social justice and environmental change. There's more linking of some of the health impacts of car pollution into environmental questions, and more a focus of the interlinking of colonialism, capitalism and white supremacy, although I would say that that still seems quite recent. I've just published an article on white environmentalism and white supremacy, and I had a great reviewer, and I had one reviewer that said, I don't even know why you're calling it white environmentalism. It's not even white. So I think we have a way to go. So, conscious of time, what's next? So this is a climate camp. I think there was a real shift in the broader environmental movement in the early 90s. What Brian Doherty says, from a well-organised and well-supported but politically moderate movement to a high-profile confrontational campaigns that were part of broader DIY culture and anarchist direct action ethos. And much of this, as I said earlier, has become internationally distinctive. When I moved to Australia to do my postdoc and I went to visit some forest protests, they were very keen to show me their tunnels because they'd been built inspired by the British activists. And British environmentalism shifted in the early 2000s to a more explicit focus on climate justice with these climate camps. Then it was diluted with the urgency of anti-war activism after 9/11 and anti-austerity struggles following the financial crash of 2007 and 8. And I think a broader shift has happened focusing on climate change, but some of the dynamism and creativity of 90s radical environmentalism has disappeared, or maybe it's been channeled elsewhere. And my research has followed the trajectory of many of the activists I met in the 90s. And after the global summits and climate camps, many dedicated themselves to living alternatives by building eco-communities like Treehouses in Wales, or developing land-based off-grid livelihoods, co-housing, social centres, community-supported agricultural schemes, generating circular economies or zero-carbon cities. So many therefore turned their resistance into a very lived and experimental alternative. Some, however, returned to activism with the emergence of Extinction Rebellion. XR felt for many of us who'd enjoyed the radical environmentalism of the 90s like a resurgence. And there was this deep familiarity with the use of the carnivalesque, samba bands and road blockades. And I love this pink boat. I thought that was amazing. So thank you, Stephen, for your picture. But there was also a bit of a bristling, as I said, in the way XR framed their activism as novel and failed to acknowledge the legacies they were building on and benefiting from. And the XR emphasis on using arrest as a tactic diminished its ability to be inclusive and was considered naive. And certainly, you know, I've enjoyed never being arrested because it wasn't a badge of honour in the 90s. You would try and avoid that at all cost. So there was also a suspicion that XR was not as grassroots or as anarchist as it might have been, with quite an assertive and named leadership, whether they intended to do that or not, that appeared to craft the strategic direction and certainly published manifestos and handbooks that you wouldn't have seen for Earth First. And of course, the societal context has radically changed too. The British police have become experts at infiltrating radical activist groups. Undercover cops in the late 90s went on to have long-term intimate relationships with many environmentalists, and legislation has been enhanced, not just the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act that actually came in 94, but that harsher interpretation of existing law. And as I said, in the last 3 years, a lot of Just Stop Oil protesters have received incredibly long sentences for peaceful protest that was common in the 90s. Of course, there's also a broader recognition of the climate emergency, but that hasn't actually resulted in, for me anyway, meaningful change in policy or practices. We still have this reliance on eco-modernist techno fixes, but it has shifted the political mood. There's now an urgency, an anxiety, and a doom, which has led some environmentalists to embrace the deep adaptation route propagated by Jem Bendell, which argues that all we can do now is adapt to the inevitable collapse of society. And in some ways, some of the groups I work with in eco-communities are doing that. That's what they're building these eco-communities for. And the worry is that he might be right. So Earth First, Extinction Rebellion, and many other radical environmental groups in Britain continue to resist environmental destruction and create alternatives. And despite the gloomy contemporary moment, it's perhaps ever more important to remember and learn from resistance of the past. So I just want to plug again Steve McQueen's exhibition of black and white photographs celebrating 100 years of protest in Britain at the Turner Contemporary. It's launching later this month. And there's a book that accompanies it, a little plug, got my chapter in it. What I really like about this is McQueen's celebration of diversity, of creativity, and the breadth of resistance, which is perfectly timed for a moment where we might all start to question what world is possible now. And I often get asked how I can remain hopeful. I generate hope by working with environmentalists who have built eco-communities. This is Lilac in Leeds. Paul Chatterton was a co-founder. And they seek to enact alternative ways of being in the world through practical, material, and social change. Also got a new book out with Bloomsbury on eco-communities. Enough plugging of myself. But perhaps more than anything, what I learned from looking back at the modern mess of this activism is the vital importance of joy, creativity, and fun. So whatever resistance we might be involved in, we might as well make it as enjoyable as possible. So I hope I leave you today with a bit of hope that however dark times might be, there is always time for dancing. Thank you.